Have you ever watched a tutorial or gotten feedback from an artist and the feedback was there's something wrong about your values? And while you understand what they mean with values, you really don't understand what they mean. So that's why in today's video, I want to really demystify the concept of values so that by the end of the video, you really have a much better understanding on how to think about values, how to use them in your art, and just how to better understand them overall. Anyway, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Antonio. I've been a professional concept artist in the game and film industry for over 8 years, ran my own studio, and now I built Artwod, basically the guided learning tool for artists. So what I want to mention is that I've broken up the aspect of values into 3 categories. We can think about this in many more ways, but I'm trying to simplify this for you so that it's much easier for you to understand how you can think about values going forward. So, number 1, and this is probably the easiest one to understand, or the one you've actually already heard of, is the aspect of local value. Now, what does local value mean? Well, it's actually like you see here. If we have a sphere like this or like this, right, both of them have a local value. One is lighter, one is darker. That's it. What does this mean? Well, it means that in the world, there's things that have a certain local value. And usually it's determined by the color that that object has. So for instance, this drawing tablet screen that I have here has a very, very dark local value because it's using black or like very dark gray, essentially. Now, if you look at my shirts, that's a very light value, and therefore it has a light local value because it's white or like close to white. So that's local value. Now, what we usually get confused by is the aspect of local value versus what I call, or what I will call for the purpose of this video, render value. And so render value is basically the values that get created because of light and shadow interacting with the object. So in this case, I've created the same 2 spheres, but I've given them the exact same values, in this case white, and we just gave it some render value. In essence, we just created a shadow side to this sphere. Now, the render value can also change. It can get darker, it can get lighter. So we could have a render value like this that is darker than the first one. So number 1 is lighter than number 2. What this basically might signify is that we might have either a stronger light interacting with this sphere, and therefore the shadow side appears darker, or overall there is more bounce light present in the environment, and therefore the shadows become darker naturally. And bounce light is often used in a lot of things, but it's very often used to pull out the shadow form. So you can definitely see more of that in my cinematic lighting video. So that's basically render value. Now what happens is a lot of us can get confused by these 2 already. And the reason for that is because these 2 almost never exist in isolation. What actually happens... Okay, sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a very informative video, but I wanted to announce one of the coolest things we've done at Artwod so far. We built a tool, call it Dropbox for Artists, where you can upload your artwork, say what you're struggling with, and share that link in every community you're a part of. Why did we do that? Well, we noticed that in almost every art community, server, or forum, people were sharing their works in progress for feedback. But it always meant you had to upload artwork individually in every channel you wanted to get feedback. And then you had to make sure you saved all of that written feedback, all of those individual paint overs, and then keep them stored somewhere safe for easy access. All in all, it's a pretty cumbersome process. So what did we build? Well, we built a free tool for the art community to centralize that feedback on your artwork. So this will make it much easier for you to track and follow up your growth. Now, how does it work?
Pretty easy. You ask visual feedback from the community by providing them with a link. Anyone with your link can easily give written and visual feedback in our app and share it back with you. And the best part, all that feedback and those drawovers are stored in one place. But wait, there's more. In the upcoming releases of the tool, we will track the type of feedback you have received and show you feedback patterns that will help you monitor what kind of feedback you receive most and how you are improving over time. So this means that you don't only have all your whips in one place, you also can monitor your growth over time. And if you're like, I've heard enough, Antonio, where can I start using this amazing tool? Well, simply go to the link in the description of this video and start using it. Oh, and did I mention it's free? And to kickstart the launch of this tool, if you use the tool and share your feedback link as a comment in this video, our team will randomly pick 30 comments to receive a drawer from me in one of our upcoming videos using that tool. So bottom line, you can basically only win. All right, back to the video. And by the way, check the link in the description.
What actually happens is that if we look at the local value, so that is the values over here, right? So these values, right? If we look at the local value on top, what tends to happen is that they are also influenced by render value. So if I add render value to sphere number 1, you can see that we now get a little bit more three-dimensionality, and we add render value to sphere number 2, it also gets a shadow. Now, for a lot of you, what you struggle with is understanding the difference between local value and render value, and therefore you often muddy up your painting because you're unable to separate the two. But basically, the way that sphere number 1 gets rendered is the exact same as how sphere number 2 gets rendered. Of course, the intensity with which we have render value can change. Again, just the same as we have down here with the white spheres. So this is basically this interplay between local value and render value. Now, the third value sort of category that I identify is compositional value. And compositional value, as the name suggests, is basically the interplay or placement of values within our canvas that have a certain purpose. Almost always it's to draw the attention of the viewer or to have the viewer ignore those places. So that's sort of the use of compositional value. And you will see this in a lot of paintings, that it's not necessarily the local value or even the render value that dictates where the artist wants you to look. It's primarily the compositional value that they will choose. So there's a lot of instances of paintings that you'll have a scenery with a castle, and normally, like, a castle has like these blue grayish stones, and that has a medium dark value. So if you were to paint it realistically, it wouldn't necessarily stand out from the painting. But there's a lot of artists that will create this castle, or they will highlight it completely white, signaling that this is the place you need to look. And this is more of a storytelling, artistic, compositional value. And there's many, many ways of having compositional value, and there's many ways to play with it. I would also make a separation, but it's a little bit of a nuance, is a lot of you, when you start drawing landscapes or painting landscapes, the first values you come into touch with is what I call atmospheric values. And it's basically the concept of, we have a very dark foreground, and then behind it, we have a somewhat lighter midground. And then going into the distance, we have like a very light background, right? So that's the aspect of foreground, midground, background. Now, for me, those are not necessarily compositional values. They're almost basically like cheat sheets. They're like cheat sheets. That's a hard word. They're like cheat sheets that help you in the beginning when you're creating landscapes or environments to sort of separate these elements in the environment. And it's basically a cheaty way to create atmospheric value. As in, the further we get into the distance, the lighter the values become. Now, of course, sometimes in life, this also happens. Think of misty mountains, and when we're at the seaside, you can really see that value getting lighter and lighter. You can literally see it with your own eyes. However, in life, if you step outside right now, yes, the sky might be lighter, but overall, there might be a lot of things that are in the distance that have a lot more of a darker value than things in the midground. And really good artists that understand how to paint landscapes and understand how to direct your eye really play with that. And they use the aspect of compositional value to really guide your eye. So these are the three value categories that I would advise you to understand. We have local value, render value, and compositional value. Now, if you want to draw, or as soon as you get into creating artwork, you have to have an interplay between all three of these. But I'm going to show you some examples that hopefully make it easier for you to understand. So, whenever you see drawings of me, I will very often have this sort of interplay of primarily render value and compositional value. And if you look at, for instance, this drawing, it's very simple. Now, what you'll see is often in a drawing, I will keep all of the local value the same, with, in this case, the exception of the loincloth, which I'm giving a darker local value just by giving it some hatching. So here, I'm not really indicating render value, I'm indicating local value just to separate it. However, most of it, like this entire creature, is it's just white, right? It's just in a local value, it could be like yellow, like we don't know what the color is, but it could be like just the entire thing is homogeneous. There's nothing that it has a different local value, but I am indicating render value. I am trying to indicate form with hatching to give you an idea of the three-dimensionality of this creature. And so that is creating value, of course, because I'm using value to do that. And therefore, it's creating render value. At the same time, I'm choosing purposefully, deliberately, not to do that anywhere down here too much, specifically in this drawing, so that I'm also creating compositional value, which means I'm having much more value grouping on top up here, more detailing, more contrast, and therefore I'm guiding your eye towards this first. So there's this interplay of render value and compositional value. If we look at this drawing, it's exactly the same. First and foremost, this guy in the background, you almost don't see him because I'm keeping the lines very, very light. So that's a compositional choice. I'm directing you to focus more here. At the same time, I'm also using both render value and local value to give you somewhat of an idea of the three-dimensionality. Now, in this case, there's actually not a lot of render value. There's just a little bit on the face, maybe just a little bit of a hint on the hand, but overall, there's not a lot of render. In this case, there's more of an emphasis on the local value. For instance, the belt, I'm using that to give you a suggestion of that this local value is darker than whatever's underneath. Same here for the belt. Now I'm choosing not to do that for everything because again, this is an aspect of compositional value. I'm just trying to indicate a few, therefore creating contrast between darker and light, and therefore I'm putting an emphasis here. And you can see that in this drawing as well. I'm doing the exact same thing. So again, there's not really a lot of local value here. Everything, again, is just white. But I'm choosing to have a lot of compositional value by guiding your eye here. Also, surrounding this guy that doesn't have a lot of darker values internally with darker values. Again, that's just a compositional choice. And because of that, he also gets some more contrast and therefore more attention, but as a secondary read. So you'll first read this and then you'll probably read this if I did my job. So this is this interplay of local value, render value, and compositional value. Now, as soon as you go to painting, that becomes increasingly important. And then local value plays much more of a bigger role because in drawing, I don't need to use local value. I have the luxury to just indicate form and to just focus on the compositional aspect of my drawing. Now, as soon as I get into painting, we have to use more values. A painting is like what you're watching here in this video. It's like this is not a drawing, right? We can't have everything here be a white canvas and just have render value and compositional value. No, we actually have local value. We have this shirt, we have this tablet, we have the background, right? We have whatever, the things that are here on the table. So we have all of these things that now have different local values. So now we need to have a really interesting balance between where do we put a certain local value, where do we emphasize render value, and how does that work compositionally? So when we do paintings, you can see that in this black and white, that's the easiest one to understand first and foremost, is this interplay is very much at play. So what I'm doing here is I'm choosing to have both the darkest or at least dark value and the lightest local value be at the area where I want you to look. It would be silly of me to give her a very white pants down here and have that a very dark contrast with this leather skirt that she has, because I'm pulling attention to something I don't want your attention. Even if I'm rendering form here, I'm rendering form on two similar local values. Therefore, they won't be that much emphasized. Even if I have render value down here, I will put most of the render value, therefore most of the three-dimensionality, I will put that over here. It's also an aspect of vignetting, but I will put most of the render value up here. So I'm doubling up on my compositional value, because the compositional value is also everything here is relatively dark, but there's one thing standing out over here, and that's this area. And although I have lighter areas down here, all of the area down here is lighter, and there's a subtle indication of render value. For instance, for this anvil, right? You can definitely see some plane changes. So I am indicating some type of form, but it's a low render value. The local color for this anvil and the block on which it is sitting is the same. It's this lightish gray, and the render value is also the same. It's like not too intense. I could have made this intenser, but that doesn't serve my compositional value. So therefore, I choose to have darker shadows and lighter lights up here. So I'm choosing to emphasize both my local value, my render value, and my compositional value. And this is how we can really guide the user. Same here with this creature. There's this tail in the back, which is almost impossible for you to see, but that's by design, right? So we know it's there. I gave it a certain local value so that you still understand that it's like the same. This should be the same, or like this yellow and this gray should be the same as what we're seeing in the foreground, but I'm giving it none render value, like nothing in terms of render value. I don't want you to perceive that as something very three-dimensional, because compositionally, that doesn't serve me, right? So I'm leaving it there with just a dark local value, no render value, and compositionally it has value. It's very dark and it's in the background. And everything here where I want you to pay attention has a bigger contrast of local value and a bigger contrast of render value. And the struggles you'll have as you evolve as an artist, or especially when you're learning to draw or paint, is to understand how color works in these value categories. So how can I, one, create a contrast in color for my local values? How can I, for my render values, use the right colors to make that stand out, to make that three-dimensional object stand out? And how can I use color properly to also create a sense of compositional value? And this is where color becomes very powerful, because in this case, we have a cooler surrounding, but we have a very, very warm focal area, right? And the more we fade away from the focal area, the colder these warm colors get. And therefore, I'm also using color compositionally to grab your attention. And in storytelling, this is where it becomes very powerful, especially like in cinema. Usually in cinema, most of the attention, at least in good cinema, most of the attention goes to compositional value. There's something I actually don't like about modern cinema, a lot of modern cinema, especially like the superhero movies. They're much more focused on render values. Like everything needs to look super 3D, or like it's literally made in 3D, right? So there's no, a lot of times there's no artistic choice to just let go of that render value and actually focus on the compositional value. Whereas a lot of the times in good cinema, like you don't need to understand all of the three-dimensionality of what this character is doing. I just want you to have that contrast between light and dark so that this is the first person you pay attention to when the scene starts. And we continue that down here, but as soon as the camera flips, we no longer need that much contrast here. We want to emphasize that contrast here. So we'll also have render value because there's not that much contrast. So we need to some degree, pull that out in a different way. And then we choose to sacrifice the other values for the compositional storytelling. And the local values, even if I were to make this guy stand out more, I could have played with the local values and could have made this like white bandage, for instance. I could have made it lighter as a local value just to grab your attention more. But I would have always sacrificed that over here just for the sake of composition. And so this is where I think your understanding of value becomes very important, because you will learn what to emphasize and what to sacrifice. And I think a really good example for this also happens in comics. I'm not claiming that my example is good. I'm just saying that when I read comics or when I look at comics specifically for the art, is that I'm seeing there's always a lot of emphasis, especially with inkers, very good inkers, on compositional value. They want you to understand at all times what is going on from a readable point of view. You need to understand the picture very fast. It's the same in cinema. And so there's this emphasis on compositional value to guide your eye. And then usually, there's not a lot of render value in comics. Usually a colorist will come in and they will emphasize that compositional value with good color to make that storytelling, to make that pop even more. Okay, just a big disclaimer, I'm not a colorist, so I'm not saying these are good colors, but I'm saying that a colorist, a really good one, they really help the inker and the person that does the line. Sometimes in this modern age, it's the same person, but they really understand on how to use color to make everything pop from a compositional point of view. They're not too worried about local value. They will use it, but sometimes they will use color very, very different from what the actual local value of that specific thing would be. You also see this a lot in more Asian paintings, where the colors, like they will have a a face, a skin tone that is white. It's just completely white. And that is not because they want to represent the local value of skin. They just want to have a compositional focus. All right. So that's my 2 cents on value. I hope it was valuable to you, pun intended. And I'll see you in the next one.